we're very used at the moment, aren't we, to hearing both a mixture of bad news and good news. So the good news is that lots of people are being vaccinated in our country, hundreds of thousands every day. The bad news is the virus is still rampant and hospitals are struggling. Or in America, the good news is that we've had a peaceful, if unusual, transition of power. But the bad news is that actually there was a riot in the very heart of democracy just a couple of weeks ago. Now, if someone asks you, do you want the good news or the bad news first? I wonder what you say. My guess is that instinctively we want to hear the good news first. But actually, the good news only makes sense in the context of the bad news. So sometimes I say to my boys, I've got good news and bad news for you. The good news is there's not much of it, but the bad news is it's your turn to do the washing up today. The good news only makes sense in the context of the bad news. If I only said there's not much of it, that wouldn't make any sense at all. It's only when they know that they're doing the washing up that the good news feels good to them. And this portion of the Bible that we've just heard read, it starts with the bad news because the good news only makes sense in the context of the bad news. In fact, Paul, who was writing this letter to the Christians in Rome whilst Nero was the emperor, he'd begun this letter by giving a headline of the good news, God's gospel, that the power of God for salvation of everyone who believes. But then he delves into 2 whole chapters of the bad news. And they're some of the darkest and most depressing chapters in the whole Bible. They're difficult to speak about, they're difficult to listen to. But until we understand the bad news, we won't understand just how good the good news is. And so bear with me as I paint the broad brushstrokes of the bad news first. You see, the bad news is that we're far more wicked than we ever realized. We like to think of the world as a fundamentally good place, with a small minority maybe being exceptions that proves the rule. But God says, no, actually, we're all deeply flawed people, far more wicked than we ever realized. And Paul started by highlighting some of the ways that secular society, people in secular society are deeply flawed. They're filled with every kind of wickedness, he says, evil, greed and depravity, full of envy and murder and strife and deceit and malice. So yes, there are some fantastically community-minded people here in Shirley. And yes, there are some real heroes in the NHS and elsewhere at the moment putting their lives on the front line for other people. But even those people who we put on a pedestal are deeply flawed inside. They can be proud and put others down. They can have anger issues and be selfish. They can shun God and trash his world. You see, secular society is far more wicked than we like to think it is. And it's no good people claiming they've never heard of God or Jesus. Paul says you only have to look at the grandeur and beauty of creation. You only have to look at the stars in the sky or the frosted cobwebs in the park to realize the hidden hand behind our world. But then Paul turns his sights from secular people to really spiritual, religious people. And he says, look, before you get too smug, you're far worse than they are. You see, when we take the moral high ground and we think, well, I'm not as bad as all that, we're just showing how judgmental we are, how short-sighted we are. We're just as capable of lying and taking what isn't ours and looking lustfully at other people. Didn't Jesus say that before we take the speck out of someone else's eye, we should take the log out of our own eye? We're more wicked than we ever realized. At the beginning of the reading we heard just now, Paul draws his conclusion. He says, well, both secular and spiritual people are sinful. And he presents this extraordinary catalogue of verses from the Old Testament to describe and to underline the fact that sin has infected each and every one of us. He says, there is no one righteous, not even one. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There's no one who does good, not even one. I mean, can you hear him hammering away at our pride? He says, look, there's no exceptions here. And there's no part of our lives that are free from sin. We are utterly sinful. He's not saying that we're incapable of doing good, but he is saying that we're incapable of not doing bad as well. We are far more wicked than we ever realized. And that was brought home to me a few years ago when someone asked me how often I broke my own moral standards, doing something that I knew was wrong, like lying or thinking bad thoughts about someone or ignoring someone in need. So I sort of thought for a moment. I said, well, let's say, I don't know, 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And then he pointed out that actually most people underestimate on this sort of thing. And, we're all a bit more grumpy in the evening. We snap at night, and a bit more grumpy in the morning when we're just getting up. So, well, okay, I said, well, let's make it 5 times a day then. He said, okay, well, multiply 5 by 365 to get how many times you fall short of your own moral standards in a year. And when you do the maths, that means that so far I have failed my own standards over 87,000 times in my life. I am far more wicked than I care to imagine. Now, maybe you're not as bad as I am. Maybe you only sin 4 times a day. And let's say you're only 18. You still have 25,000 black marks against your name. You are far more wicked than you care to think. And those are just the times when we've fallen short of our own standards, let alone God's standards. And the thing is, that puts us in a perilous situation. You see, a couple of times in these chapters, Paul has said, he's talked about God's wrath. He said, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people. And then he said, because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of God's wrath. And there's no human way out of this. As Paul puts it, no one will ever be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Now, we don't like thinking about God's wrath, do we? We hate the idea that we might be storing up for ourselves God's wrath. But we can't just airbrush out the bits of the Bible that we find so desperately, painfully uncomfortable. And so what is this wrath of God? It's not God getting angry like I sometimes get angry, suddenly snapping at the boys when my patience runs out, or taking out my frustrations on people who don't deserve it. God's wrath isn't about him being spiteful or hating people who've offended him. No, God's wrath is his calm, settled, and righteous judgments against those who are and do evil. And that includes me, and that includes you. So not only are we far more wicked than we ever realized, but our predicament is far more deadly than we ever feared. We are facing the wrath of God with no way out. This bad news is so heavy, isn't it? Now, a couple of years ago, Andrew and I took our boys to the Tower of London. We'd really enjoyed watching the Johnny English films, so we thought we'd go and see the Crown Jewels in person. And if you've never been there, the room itself with the Crown Jewels in, it's fairly dark, and they're sort of set against this black background, and then spotlights illuminate them to show off their splendor. And so far in this letter, it's as though Paul has been painting the black background of the bleakness of our human predicament before God, being utterly wicked and deserving of God's judgment. But then he suddenly turns on the spotlight and brings out the crown jewel so that we can gasp at the beauty and the majesty of the gospel. Only the jewel turns out to be a cross, and the crown turns out to be a crown of thorns. Here's what he says. But now the righteousness of God, that is, a right standing before God, has been made known, given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. And we go, what? How? That those who are utterly sinful and deserving God's wrath can be made right with God? This is good news indeed. It turns out that we're more loved than we ever realized and dreamed. And Paul goes on, he says, look, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came through Jesus Christ. God presented him as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. Now, there's quite a lot of jargon in there, but Paul is emphasizing in this passage that the righteousness of God, that this right standing with God, is received by faith in Christ's death. And so it's not how strong my faith is that matters, It's where I put my faith that matters. I mean, let's say that I want to fly to some nice Mediterranean island for a bit of winter sun. And let's say that I'm really confident that because the airports are closed, actually, if I just strap loads of feathers onto my arms and flap really wildly, I'm going to get there. Well, of course, that's not going to work, is it? However confident I am in that, it's not the strength of my faith which is important, it's what I place my faith in that matters. But if I then, if the travel restrictions are lifted and I go to the airport and I however nervously I get on a plane thinking, look, I've never flown on this plane before, I'm not sure if it's going to get there and hold me. It doesn't matter how small my faith is, it's what I put my faith into that matters. And the airplane will get me there. And if we just have an incy-wincy little bit of faith in Jesus and his death on the cross, then we are loved far more than we ever dreamed. We are saved. It's not the strength or amount of our faith that matters, it's what and who we put our faith into the death of Christ on the cross. Now, there's so much that we could pull out of these verses. If you've never studied them in detail before, I really would urge you to do so. They are probably the most important sentences that have ever been written about the most important event that's ever happened in the history of the world, to help us understand why Jesus died on the cross. It wasn't an accident of history. It wasn't just a miscarriage of justice. It was the very power of God to bring us salvation. And as I say, do study them in more detail. I'll put a link on the online church page if you want to listen to a longer talk which goes into more detail on these particular sentences and helps us understand the crown jewel that is the cross. But I'm just going to pick out one word from it, the word justified. Now, this word comes from a picture of a law court. This week, as many outgoing US presidents do, Donald Trump pardoned lots of convicted criminals. It's a strange tradition, freeing people from jail who've already been found guilty of crimes. Now, when a US president pardons someone, that person is still considered guilty. They're just let off part of their punishment. The crime still shows up on their police check. But when Jesus justifies us, he does so much more than simply pardon us. He acquits us of all charges. He declares us not guilty at all. And so he takes on himself both our punishment and our criminal conviction. And so he can give us both his innocence and his freedom. So if you haven't yet trusted in Jesus' death, you remain guilty as charged and facing punishment, storing up wrath for yourselves on the day of God's wrath. But if you have trusted in Jesus' death and made that trust personal, he took your conviction and he paid your punishment. You are justified. We are far more loved than we ever dreamed. And I remember explaining all of this years ago to a student, that we're far more wicked than we ever realized, yet far more loved than we ever dreamed. That we can't do anything to earn our salvation, but that God simply gives it to us as a gift. And when the penny dropped for this student, she was over the moon. And she said, look, this is so liberating. And it is. It's such good news. And do you see that the good news only makes sense in the context of the bad news? That the taste of forgiveness and freedom is all the sweeter when we've tasted the bitterness of guilt and God's wrath. And those who've understood this message want to respond in worship. We're going to do that in a few minutes. How could we not thank God for what he's done for us? But here's the application that Paul wants to draw out as well. He says, look, if we believe in Christ, then boasting in ourselves is impossible. And yet, how often are we tempted to do that? I could think that I deserve to get into God's good books because for all my inadequacies, actually, I've tried hard as a pastor. And I've even written a couple of books that have helped point people to faith in Jesus. But as soon as I start thinking those sorts of things, then I move my trust away from Christ and towards myself. Or sometimes when I'm talking with the family of someone who's just died, preparing their funeral, I ask the family, tell me about any faith they had. And they'll reply, oh, well, he sang in the church choir when he was a boy. Or her parents sent her to Sunday school. Or he loved watching songs of praise. But you see, as soon as we put our hope in things that we've done, boasting in ourselves, we prove that our hope isn't really in Christ alone. Or you might think that you deserve God's approval because you've, put up with an awful spouse for years and years and years, or you've managed to bring up children pretty successfully, single-handed, or because you've helped with loads of community initiatives or something. But boasting in ourselves is the opposite of believing in Christ. No, we can only receive the gift of God's salvation if we come empty-handed. Nothing in my hands I bring, simply to the cross of Christ I cling. And when we stop boasting in ourselves, that doesn't just transform our relationship with God, it transforms our relationships with other people as well. Humble people are so much nicer to know, aren't they? So the bad news is that we're far more wicked than we ever realized, and our predicament is far more perilous than we ever feared. But the good news, the wonderful news, is that we're far more loved than we ever dreamed.